Jesus had a touch.
Okay, so he's deaf, so Jesus couldn't talk to him. So what does Jesus do? He uses motions. Oftentimes a person in that situation, they would like to be healed physically, but the greater healing is internal. They have internalized some feelings about themselves or about their value in the sight of their peers or even in God's sight, that those kinds of things need to be healed.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Guide Through the Bible podcast. I'm Anthony High, and today we're continuing our series in the Gospel of Mark. And I'm here with our Bible teacher, J. Mark Horst, to look at Mark chapter 7, verses 31 to 37. In this episode, we're going to look at how Jesus related to people, especially how he welcomed their faith, he respected their feelings, and then he redirected the glory to God. And in the end, people said he did all things well. J. Mark, as we look into this episode especially, we would say Jesus had a touch. And there's a bit of a story that we thought of with how Jesus touched people, but it's not a Bible story.
No, certainly not. The story comes out of Greek mythology, and some people would have heard of King Midas. And today we use that term. When someone is very successful, we might say he has the Midas touch. And so King Midas...
There's a muffler shop that way.
Right. King Midas actually found a follower of the god Dionysus, and he treated him well. I'm shortening the story, by the way. And anyway, as a result of his care for this subject of the gods said, okay, I'll give you anything you want. Well, he's a king, has all this power, and he's greedy. Unfortunately, many kings are that way. And so he says, okay, my wish is I want everything I touch to turn to gold. Well, that sounds great, right? Until he picks up his food. It turns to gold. He can't eat it. He picks up his drink, same thing. And then he goes and hugs his daughter, and she turns to gold. And so he realizes that it was a very foolish wish. And he actually returns to the God who granted his wish and asks for a way to get out from under what was happening. And it was difficult, but the God gave him a certain thing that he could do, and when he did that, then he was restored, and things no longer turned to gold when he touched them. And so the idea is he certainly did not do everything well. That was a foolish choice. I mean, it sounded good on the surface, and I think I've made choices like that where, hey, that sounds really good, and then you make the choice, and the consequences begin to be set in motion. You say, oops, not that way.
Yeah. But today we're looking at Jesus.
That's right.
And he did all things well.
Absolutely.
But he didn't turn things to gold.
No.
Instead, he restored people and made them whole. In some ways, I'd rather have that touch, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking also because the one was very selfish. And then Jesus is the opposite. He's very giving. He said of himself that he didn't come to be served, but to serve.
Right. Yeah. Well, that could take us right into the text here. Like I said at the beginning, we're looking at Mark chapter 7, verses 31 to 37. We're finishing the chapter.
Mm-hmm.
I'll read it, and then I'd like to look at some of the context to it because it's part of a much larger story that's
right.
going on. Beginning here at verse 31. Again, departing from the region of Tyre and Sidon, he came through the midst of the region of Decapolis to the Sea of Galilee. Then they brought to him one who was deaf and had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to put his hand on him. And he took him aside from the multitude, and put his fingers in his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. Immediately his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was loosed, and he spoke plainly. Then he commanded them that they should tell no one. But the more he commanded them, the more widely they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, He has done all things well. He makes both the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. The previous two episodes that were recorded here have to do with this idea of defilement.
Mm-hmm.
looking back at that, what can you summarize the context of this? I mean, I gave you a little bit there, but
Right. Well, we started out with the Pharisees in the beginning of the chapter finding fault with Jesus' disciples because they were eating without properly washing their hands.
Yeah.
And then they got into the discussion about what really makes a person unclean. And then immediately from that, we go into the story of the Syrophoenician woman, and now this experience with another Gentile audience. And so the whole idea between clean and unclean as far as people is here. So the Jews would have seen the Gentiles as being unclean. And again, we have Jesus actually touching this man who was a Gentile, which makes himself
likely. I mean, I
clean.
guess we don't know that.
We don't know for sure, but this is a Gentile area.
Right.
And that is significant. The first half of the chapter takes place. There's this back and forth between the Jews and Jesus, Jewish leaders and Jesus. And then the second half of the chapter, you have these two incidents with Gentiles where Jesus seems to be trying to help the disciples understand that, again, defilement comes from the inside. It's not a matter of where you were born or what your nationality is.
Yeah. I was just intrigued at how these accounts are just linked together as you go through them.
Yeah.
And verse 14, when I was looking at this earlier, he specifically says, "Hear me, everyone, and understand." And then he, at the end of it, he opens this man's ears and looses his tongue. Also, there's some travel involved here. Can you describe a little bit where Jesus was going? You mentioned Gentile territory,
right?
But how do we know that?
Yeah. So if you follow the narrative prior to chapter 7, he's in he's in the Jewish area, and then he goes north to Tyre and Sidon. And he ends up in the end of this chapter down in the Decapolis, which was on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. And instead of coming south along the coast of modern-day Lebanon and into Israel and down that way, he makes kind of like a horseshoe. It would be kind of like somebody being in Washington, D.C. today. They want to go to Richmond, but they go by the way of Philadelphia.
Okay.
And so it's like a horseshoe, but it's way out of the way. And we know that Jesus didn't do anything random. I mean, everything that he did had a purpose. So there was a purpose why he did that.
I guess one of the thoughts I had is that was unclean territory.
Absolutely.
Decapolis was
Gentile.
Yeah, but it was also known as a heathen. Heathen territory is what I was looking for.
Yeah. And part of the reason why he made that swing around to the north before he came down to the area of Decapolis may have been to avoid Herod's territory, because as we had looked at earlier, Herod had put John the Baptist to death, and Jesus wanted to avoid that area.
He's avoiding that area, but also, I guess, working the disciples through what it means to be clean on the inside.
Yeah, if I had to say, which I don't know for sure, but if I had to say, the avoiding Herod's territory would have been secondary. I think the primary reason was that Jesus had Gentile people that he wanted to minister to, wanted to serve.
There you go. And I guess along with that, Mark, we think, was writing primarily to the Greeks.
Right, that's right.
So again, connecting out, this is not a primarily Jewish Messiah. He's a Messiah for the world.
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah. All right. Well, looking more at the text here in the scripture, what else do you see with it, and what can we learn?
Well, the fact that this man was deaf and had a speech impediment, he was brought by friends or family. It doesn't specifically say that. It says they brought him to Jesus. And that reminded me of the paralyzed man, that his 4 friends brought him to Jesus.
Very similar story.
Broke up the roof, and left him down through. And this, my understanding would be that this deaf man had some ability to speak, but he could not speak in a way that was intelligible to most people. Most of what he said was not able to be understood. And so another thing that's interesting about this is Mark is the only one who mentions this particular incident. The other gospel writers don't record it. And there may be a variety of reasons for that, and I don't know that we have time to go into it, but the particular word that Mark used under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit for deafness goes back to Isaiah chapter 35. Of course, that would have to be in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, but it uses the same Greek word where the prophet says, when Messiah comes, then the eyes of the blind shall be opened and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. And that's in the context of the restoration of God's kingdom. And so, yeah. And Isaiah 34 is a chapter that is just filled with gloom and destruction and judgment. And then chapter 35 comes and offers, what the Messiah is going to do when he comes. And I believe that time that Isaiah was talking about didn't come fully during Jesus' earthly ministry. It's still in the future. But the healing of the deaf man is kind of like an anticipation. This is what it will look like when that time comes.
And wouldn't you say most of his healings were that way?
Right.
Pointing to...
And another interesting thing about Isaiah 35, if you read it, is you get the very distinct impression that salvation is of the Jews.
Okay.
And that's another thing that kind of intrigues me, the connection here between those two, because that was the mindset, and here's Jesus. In fact, that's what Jesus had just told the Syrophoenician woman, no, I can't do anything for you because you're a Gentile, but I'm putting it in my own words.
But then he turns around and he goes and does it.
Right, that's right. And so we talked about in the last episode, he's trying to help the disciples along this path to what you said earlier. The gospel is not just for the Jew, it's for everybody.
There's a number of other prophecies that go with that.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we'll save that for another time.
Okay.
So those are some reflections on that. The word here that Jesus uses, that's Aramaic. Is that right?
I think so, yeah.
And then Mark, as he does,
translates it. Yep. Yeah,
Okay.
That's right. So what does it mean? What does it reveal to us about Jesus? Well, first of all, the men or the friends, they, whomever they were, had faith. They believed that Jesus could help this man, and so they brought him to Jesus. And that's important for us to remember, and we see that Jesus honored their faith. I think the man himself had faith, and I think he was healed. I know that he was healed because the text says that physically, but I believe he was also healed spiritually.
He wouldn't have had a great way of hearing about this,
Right.
He couldn't have heard about it.
Right.
He would have had to see it in order to know.
Right.
So he needed help.
Yeah, he did.
He was actually kind of helpless.
Yeah, and I guess there's a sense in which we're all like that. We all have a disability. We all need help when it comes to,
particularly the Gentiles
who
didn't have the scripture.
Well, that's true. Yeah, they didn't.
There's a couple of more connections in there.
Yeah, and I think the idea of Jesus respecting the dignity, one thing you realize is some of the language that the disciples used in their interactions with people that they felt were beneath them. And we can do the same thing. We're kind of dismissive. We use terms that may be derogatory or something like that. But Jesus doesn't do that. And Jesus shows compassion to the person no matter who they are, no matter where they're from. And I think that's really important. And so as we look at this, you can read the story and you can say, oh, well, it sounds nice, but what does it really mean? And what's our takeaway from it? I think that's what's really important.
Well, you asked a question there about what is our takeaway. You talked about the faith there. But what else? This man here, he's in the middle of everything. Maybe he didn't want to be healed. Well,
I can't imagine.
Yeah, but
yeah, I can imagine that.
If you would let that.
He couldn't live a normal life as we would consider it. If you can't hear and that makes sense. If you can't hear, how do you know if you're forming the words properly or that sort of thing? So it's a very difficult situation. But Jesus responds at least to the faith of the men, and he does not hesitate to interact with human weakness. And I think that's instructive for us. Our society often looks at people who have a disability as somehow being less than. They're not whole. They are. We wouldn't say worth less. We wouldn't say worthless, but we might say worth less. And because our society tends to assign value based on what people can do, what they can accomplish, what contribution they can make. And so somebody like this is not able to contribute very much because of their disability. And Jesus didn't see it that way.
And that's where, an example of an application to that would be helping those people, caring for them,
Right.
giving them dignity, and in a sense, maybe not bringing them full healing, but helping them.
Right.
Right. I mean, there's ways you can help disabled and invalids or whatever it might be, whatever the situation may be.
That's right.
In a sense, you are bringing healing, even though it may not be a complete healing that we're looking for.
Oftentimes, a person in that situation, they would like to be healed physically, but the greater healing is internal. They have internalized some feelings about themselves or about their value in the sight of their peers or even in God's sight, that those kinds of things need to be healed. And so just think about this, man. Think about how you would feel if, people would avoid you because, I don't want to interact with him because it's just so awkward. I can't, and I've been there. I've felt that, somebody's has a really difficult time expressing themselves. And, you do one of two things. You either stay away or you try to help them. You try to tell them what they're trying to say.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever had that experience or not, but I have.
Yeah, I'm sure. I guess one of the things that we were talking about here as far as main points to this was that this man was taken aside.
Right.
Like his feelings were being respected.
Right. That's right. And I think that's an important point. Yeah. Jesus took him aside. He was in the crowd, and Jesus did not make. It's interesting. Jesus doesn't do the same thing always, because think of the man in the synagogue with the withered hand. He said, "Stand up." Yeah. He waits till has everybody looking at him, and then he says, "Stretch out your hand." Here, he takes this man aside, and I think there's a lesson there for us. You don't approach every situation exactly the same way. Jesus didn't. So he takes this man aside and heals him in a sense. I would say semi-privately anyway. Obviously, the people knew what was going on because when they saw what happened, they responded, and said, "Hey, this is amazing."
Right.
Yeah. But he did take him aside. And it's interesting because, okay, so he's deaf, so Jesus couldn't talk to him. So what does Jesus do? He uses motions like we would do. Like I remember trying to do that when I was overseas. You don't know the language, so you try to make people understand what you want. I want to eat, something like that. So Jesus, touches his ears, and then spits. I'm not sure exactly what that was all about, but I have some ideas. And then touches his tongue and says to him, "Be loosed." One thing I did come across that was very interesting to me, the text isn't really clear. Did Jesus spit on his fingers and then touch the man's tongue? We say, "Oh, that's really gross." But I understood from Alfred Edersheim that the rabbis taught that saliva actually had medicinal properties. And I don't know where they came up with that. But anyway, that's what he said. And so the use, I was thinking about this, the use of a bodily fluid, okay? So in this case, Jesus' saliva, to heal this man's impediment could foreshadow the bodily fluid of Jesus, his lifeblood, which brought healing to all of us. And I never had considered that before. That was just kind of a new thought to me. Just like I said, it sounds gross to us in our way of thinking, and yet I thought that was an interesting flow of thought, from saliva to the blood of Christ. One in some sense, brought physical healing, and the other brought complete wholeness in the spirit.
Well, that is interesting. I was thinking along a slightly different line.
Okay.
There was also, I think if I understand correctly, the understanding that the tassels of the Messiah would have power.
Right.
So you have the woman with the issue of blood wanted to touch them to be healed, and she was. Whereas if you're saying they taught that saliva had medicinal properties, well, then the saliva of the Messiah would again
Right.
bring healing. So I don't know. I mean, that could, both of them, I think, work.
Right.
Although,
Yeah. Yeah, and then when you read the
Conjecture.
text there, yes, there is some conjecture there. You read that when Jesus was in the process of healing him, what does it say? He looked up to heaven and sighed, or what's the term that
yeah,
is there?
looking up to heaven, he sighed and said.
Okay, and I think the KJV says he groaned,
Okay.
and I found that to be interesting, and I asked myself why? Why did Jesus groan? Was he grieving over the effects of sin that brought on this man's disability? And I thought of Paul's words in Romans where he says that we know that the whole creation groans in travail, in birth pains, waiting for the redemption of the body. He said, we have the first fruits of the Spirit, and even we are groaning within ourselves, waiting for that time of adoption and redemption. And I'm just wondering, was Jesus thinking ahead to the cross and what he was going to? I don't know. But he groaned or he sighed for some reason. There was some reason. Otherwise, wouldn't be there.
I thought maybe you were going to quote about the Holy Spirit uttering groanings that
Okay, well,
groanings that cannot be uttered.
Yeah, that's true.
Be along the same line.
So this man went from complete deafness to perfect hearing at Jesus' touch. And I really like the Old English of the KJV because it says the string of his tongue was loosed. I don't know if that's where we get the.
There is a medical condition where the tongue is actually connected too far front.
Okay.
Or they go in and they clip it nowadays.
That sounds painful. But we talk about people being tongue-tied, and that string of his tongue was loose made me think about that. So, but one of the things that I thought about was imagine how that man felt. I mean, here he was. He had dealt with this impediment. I don't know. It says he was a man, so I don't know how long, but anyway, long time.
A grown-up.
Yeah, for sure. A grown-up, yeah. And now that disability, that shame was gone. And that had to be powerful. It really did, yeah. And I don't know what it's like to be deaf. I know what it's like to be partly deaf. I've worn hearing aids for a number of years now, and so I can empathize a little bit more with people that have a disability like that. And it's embarrassing to interject something into a conversation and realize that you missed the subject completely. And so I know a little bit what that's like, and I can imagine that one day I'll have perfect healing again. Perfect hearing is what I wanted to say. Healing and healing too. Yeah.
All right. Well, moving into the final point of what Jesus did with this.
Right.
Say more.
Yeah. Well, we talked about him wanting to remain anonymous. In other words, he didn't want the focus on the healing. He didn't want them to brag him up, we might say. And he commanded, as you read there, that they should tell no one. Of course, the more that he commanded them, the more they shouted it out, told it abroad. And we have a similar incident in Mark chapter 1 already, where he healed a leper and told him the same thing. And and then as a result of that, Jesus couldn't enter the towns anymore because the people would overwhelming. And so he resorted to teaching in the countryside. And so as I think about Jesus' ministry, the people try to imagine how you would respond to somebody with that kind of power. You would tend to elevate them and really look up to them. And Jesus is certainly one that we can look up to, but he did not want to be seen as a king in the earthly sense. And that's what it seems like throughout his ministry, he continually had to tamp down those expectations that he is going to set up a kingdom and free them from Rome. And so he told them, when he was talking to them about how the kings of the Gentiles rule over them, he's talking to his disciples about their pecking order. And he said, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. And so a servant, as I think about it, a servant shuns publicity. He just does what he's told, and he doesn't seek the limelight. In fact, a servant rarely receives public recognition for what he's done. And I thought of Luke chapter 17, where Jesus illustrated that point, and he said, how many of you, if you have a servant and he's plowing or he's taking care of the flocks, and he comes in from the field and you say to him, oh, okay, come in here and sit down and eat. He said, no, that's not the way it works. You say to him, okay, change your clothes and serve me, and after I have eaten, then you can eat. And afterwards, then the servant says, I'm just an unprofitable servant because I have only done what I was supposed to do. And I thought that was interesting because that's not generally how we operate. We want people to notice what we've done, and I think it's right that we do acknowledge people's contribution and give praise, but we shouldn't be seeking that ourselves. We shouldn't be serving for that reason so that we get recognition and that people want to, that temptation to pride and undeserved credit is enormous. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For sure.
And so Jesus, even in his perfection, he's still human. He is tempted in every way like we are.
Well, that gives us the observation, the meaning of it, but what do we do with this? What does life look like with the lessons that are in here?
Well, I think there are a number of things that we can draw from this, and of course, the main lesson is that everything Jesus does, he does well, and he does that in our lives. It doesn't always seem that way. I mean, in this case, this man was healed and he was completely restored. Jesus doesn't always do that. And so sometimes to confess, Jesus does all things well is a statement of faith, because it doesn't feel like he's doing well, not by me anyway.
And Jesus didn't heal everybody.
He did not. That's true. That's true. And it's important for us to remember that. And so I think, we need to understand how Jesus will respond to our faith. And we can be instrumental in helping bring other people to Jesus, whether that is initially for salvation, or maybe they've had a really difficult experience in life that they're struggling with. They don't know really how to move past it. We can bring them to Jesus, and when I say bring them to Jesus, Jesus uses people, maybe ourselves or maybe someone else who has a better understanding or who has been through that situation. So we can be like the friends of this man and bring other people to Jesus. We can do that. We can respect other people's feelings. When we're dealing with people, and especially people that and we all have disabilities, right? Okay, so we're all broken. So thinking about that, how there are some situations you don't just bring out into the public and say, this needs to be dealt with. You try to work quietly and respect the person's dignity and their privacy and that sort of thing. And that's what Jesus did in this case here. So those are some things we can do. We can also redirect glory. People do compliment us for things that we do. And I don't think it's proper to ignore that. In other words, when someone thanks us for doing something, we can respond to that. But we should learn how to redirect the glory to God. And so we could say something like, you're welcome. I was glad for the privilege to serve, do whatever the thing was. My intention was to bring glory to God, or something like that. Not some kind of a pat phrase that you use every time, but just this idea of directing people's, it's not me, the power is not in me, I'm directing people to Jesus. I think that strengthens our witness. Sometimes people look at us and they say, well, I could never live like you do. Well, it's not me. It's the power of God in me. I couldn't live like I do either if it was just me.
God's doing what?
I face the same temptations and I am prone to the same sins everybody else is, but it's only the power of Christ in me that keeps me. And so there again, you redirect that glory to God.
Pushing that back through.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I think that gives a good summary of what we looked at here today. Jesus recognized the faith of the friends and obviously of the man that needed healing, but he also took into consideration his feelings, took him aside and cared for him, and then also, dealing with that fame, that notoriety, I guess you'd say, that goes with it, and pointing that back to his Father. I think that's a good summary of this passage and gives us a good foundation to work off of. And then living that out, like how do you live that out in your context? Being able to care for people. I think there's something to be said here for those that we could care for, like that man, and in a sense bring healing to those around us. I think that's a good lesson. That's something I'd like to take away from it. And how can I bring that to the people around me? And then going back to King Midas, Jesus came with a touch.
That's right.
He touched the unclean here. He touched the Gentile.
The untouchables.
Yeah, he did. And cared for them. Thank you for joining us today. If you could do us a favor, I'd love if you could share this podcast with those around you, and also to comment and to let us know what you think of it. Was there something we missed or something we could have added? We appreciate that. And come back and join us again the next time as we continue to look at the Gospel of Mark.